We're back. Welcome, friends, to the Invitation Podcast. Kyle Matthews.
Phil Schiavone.
And we're back for Season 4, Episode 2. This one is on fear. We got a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. Last episode, we talked about fasting, and there's so much there. So many applications in the Bible, so many practical, tactical applications that we can look at in modern 21st century life. And I think the same is this topic of fear. It just touches every aspect of our life. Mm-hmm. And guess what? It was still there in a big way in biblical life. Mm-hmm. So we're going to dive into this again as you get used to this new format. Phil's going to break down what this looked like from a biblical perspective, pull out a couple highlights that we can play around with, and then we're going to dive into what does this mean for my life? How can we start to apply this stuff? What are we wrestling with? How can we wrestle with it? And then hopefully you walk out of here with some good next steps that you can apply and start making your life better right now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kyle. We are diving into the topic of fear for all sorts of reasons. I said that with fasting too. One of them is I remember, this is probably a decade ago now, that I did a word study on the word fear with the hope of, gosh, maybe the Bible isn't actually asking us to fear God. Like maybe the word means reverence or awe or, something other than like be afraid of God.
Right.
I was just having one of those moments where I was like, it can't possibly mean this. And then it means fear. And so I was like, oh, okay. But thankfully, that same word search and that same word study 10 years ago led me down many of the verses that we're going to cover today that actually tell a narrative around that rather than just a flat definition, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Well, and that wrestling is so healthy. Mm-hmm. Like, I think, we've talked about this in a bunch of our different episodes, but if you get those questions in your head, there aren't taboo questions. The Lord is big enough. Wrestle with him on these until you get to a place of peace. That's something that you've done, with a lot of, the students you've interacted with over the years, and ultimately, God's word can handle this stuff. And, it may not be a 5-minute deal. This may be a wrestling that goes on for quite a bit of time, but I guarantee you there's fruit at the other end of that search.
Yeah. And we hope to bring that fruit to you today. And I think this is one of the benefits of living in the era of podcasting.
Yes.
In the era of books, right? The printing press. We're still technically in that era.
All right, Gutenberg.
Right? Is that what people spend sometimes their lives researching.
Yes.
We get to digest for 5 hours reading a book.
Sure. For better or for worse.
What you and I have spent weeks and even years processing. About an hour-long podcast. You now get to hear and wrestle with yourself. But we've done a lot of the hard work for you in this podcast. And that's a good thing. Yeah. We encourage the hard work.
Yeah.
But we're throwing this out here to hopefully help you along in your journey and progress you in a way that allows you to do the same for others, right?
Sure.
And that's part of the invitation.
And we can bring all the tools to the table, but you still got to build a house, right? Yeah. At the end of the day, right. When you talk about building something worthwhile, they say about, sports, well, kids, sometimes you got to take the stairs, right?
Yep. And man, if there was ever a topic that had relevancy towards coming face to face with it,
sure,
it might be fear.
There you go.
And so let's start with the scriptural journey here. I've got a bunch to get through, and I'll do my best to not just plow through it, but to journey through it and make sense of each stage of the way here. And as always, we'll start in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. We're actually going to read a couple verses from Genesis 2. And this is after God has created everything. Now we're in Genesis 2, and there's more of a narrative escape of what's going on in creation. God's already made man, and now he's about to make woman. And this is what we read. Well, he has made woman, and then the man sees the woman for the first time. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." And so there's no sense of fear. The word fear is not in this passage. But this is the setup. This is the context for when fear makes its first appearance. And what I want you to know, and I got to make sure we don't get that little E next to this episode about explicit here, right? Like how I word this. I read this intentionally because being naked in front of anybody else
Sure.
is a barrier to cross, right? Like,
Right.
now maybe you've grown up in a sport or something like that and you've gotten a lot comfortable, or maybe you live in a nudist colony, or yeah, maybe something like that. But the idea here is that in God's good world, nakedness did not produce shame, did not produce fear, and there's a lot of different ways that nakedness could produce fear, not just interrelationally, but it's a 33-degree rainy day right now. If I was naked outside, I'd have some fears, right? Like if I'm facing animals in the wild and I'm naked, I've got a little bit more fear than
Sure.
if I don't have armor or weaponry or something. And so this idea of being naked and unashamed. They were naked, they didn't feel shame, but also I love this little line about a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife and they become one flesh. Leaving the comfort of home.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Is a fear. And actually like I work with college students. The generation of college students are the most lonely generation this world has ever seen. And so
the most connected and simultaneously the most lonely.
Yes.
Yeah.
The most lonely, and that's because of fear. All right. And so in God's good world, you are able to leave the comfort of your home without fear. And so that's the context the ideal, I should say, not only the context, but the ideal and the path forward as far as, I'm going to say fear, but the path forward without fear, that is still intended for us to this day. Right? So when God created the world and said it's good, and even it's very good, the echo of that goodness still resounds today, even as sin has its way, which leads us to Genesis 3:10-11. And we could read through the whole chapter on this, but to summarize quickly, the man and the woman, they listen to the voice of the serpent, they cave, and they take the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even though God said, if you eat of it, you will surely die. And then immediately they feel fear, right? Then they run, they hide. And when God enters the picture, and this is the part we're going to look at, God says, where are you? Which, like, I always love this image of, like, was the God looking underneath his leg and looking around and stuff? Like, where, like, the sovereign God of the universe really lost the only two humans in all of creation. But that's his heart, right? Yep. His heart is to seek and save that which is lost. And so he says, where are you? And the man answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid. So there it is, our first time we hear this word. And I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. He said, who told you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? So here's our first really important point about fear, Kyle. It's in God's good world, we could leave the comfort of home naked and still have no fear. We could truly be our true selves, and we could choose a partner to live life with, leaving the comforts of our home and not feel fear. But now Adam's with that partner, and he's proclaiming that he's afraid and that he's naked. And God's response is, who told you that you were naked? So here's our first point about fear. Fear is when the wrong voice tells you about your circumstances.
About it. Yeah.
So his nakedness didn't change. But the voice of the serpent told him he was naked in a bad way. Yep. Where God's truth was naked in a good way. Yep. Right? And that subtle difference.
The beauty of creation was twisted in a powerful way.
Yeah. And the voice, right? Yeah. So I was going to use an example that I'm coming to later. But like there's a voice that tells us that roller coasters are scary, and there's a voice that tells us that roller coasters are fun. But the experience is exactly the same. Yep. Right? Now, it can be tainted by fear or excitement. But the experience, the buckling up, the up and the down of the roller coaster, the upside down of it, all of it's the exact same. But it's the voice in our head that changes the experience for us. And when you know it, the Bible has that too. Right there in Genesis 3. And I use a roller coaster example, but gosh, I'm sure we'll get into this as the episode goes on. Fear can be just the dividing line between great fruit and great outcomes in this life, and zero fruit. Yes. And zero outcomes. And not that it's totally about outcomes.
Even diminishment, right? The enemy wants to diminish. If he can diminish us, that is sometimes enough.
Yeah. and take from us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, which I'll get to.
Great. Okay. So they're still naked, but a different voice has spoken to them concerning their nakedness, and that voice brought fear. And so this is the first stop of saying, and I think you're going to cover this too, is we got to pay attention to the voices in our head, right? And I don't want to make us out to be schizophrenic. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We've made great strides in treating people that struggle with that. But it's the idea of listening to our thinking. And is this the voice of God? Is this the voice of my spirit interacting with God, or is this the voice of a different spirit?
Yep, and that's a muscle. That's discernment, and that muscle gets built over time, and it gets built with a community of safe people.
Yeah. And speaking of, like, the first fear I ever identified in my life was public speaking. And my worst grade in college was speech class. One time when I was sharing that, I said my worst fear in college was speaking class. And I was like, that's not how you say that. And so, like, yeah, it's amazing. It really was an act of God 2 years later that made me want to public speak.
Sure.
But I had to overcome that fear.
Sure.
It wasn't a miraculous act of God. It was a long obedience in one direction, as Eugene Peterson says. So, sometimes these initial fears that we stumble upon can actually be the doorway to our professions, our vocations, even our gifts and our calling. And that's why it's not just about overcoming fear. It really is about joining God on a journey, joining God in his invitation.
Yeah. Well, in all teams, I think it ties into identity. And oftentimes fear is a tool that the enemy uses to keep us from living out our God-given identity.
Yeah. And so here, the first scriptures we're looking at, talking about fear, the voices that we listen to, and how that defines things. This one, I think, is an interesting twist. So we're going to look at Exodus chapter 1, 15 to 21.
Mm-hmm. So set us up. What's happening here in Exodus? So
at the very beginning of Exodus, we've got a Pharaoh that is just angry that there are so many Israelites in Egypt. And at the end of Genesis 2, it was Joseph and the Israelites that were a huge blessing.
Yep. So this is the new Pharaoh.
This is a new
Pharaoh. He's not a fan. New regime.
He mad.
Yeah, big mad, as the kids say.
Big
the new Pharaoh was big mad. Did not like these Israelites.
Yeah, and they are just growing in number, and Pharaoh has enslaved them, so they don't pose an actual risk, but the Pharaoh's afraid.
Yeah,
and so he starts to wonder, well, I can't have them rise up against me. So he starts putting on these limits about how they can make bricks and how they can take lunch breaks and how they can't form unions, like he starts putting all these limits on them. And then he comes to these Hebrew wives to continue Hebrew midwives. Okay. And so if you don't know what a midwife is, it's a professional person that helps people in labor as they give birth, right?
Yep.
Have been around for centuries. And so this is the plot. The king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. I love this passage for a million reasons, so I better keep focused here.
Right. But there's some other, if you want to go back and listen to some other episodes, this is another example of just incredible women in the Bible that are obedient to God and bring really good fruit. So.
Yeah, and I mean, right off the top, the Pharaoh isn't given a name, but the women are. The two, and that's a signal right off the top of okay, I know who we're supposed to pay attention to here, right? But notice, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. And so in this moment where it could have been really easy to fear the Pharaoh, the Bible goes out of the way to say they feared God. And so now, this fear that was a really bad thing in Genesis 3 is proving to be something else here, right? I'm going to hedge saying it's good because I want to unpack this. But they feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. So I paired this up intentionally with Genesis 3 because the opposite happened in Genesis 3. They felt fear. They weren't sure they would get wisdom without grabbing from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But then it just brought on more fear, and so they were hiding in their nakedness. This one is a serpent-like figure in the Pharaoh is tempting them to do something wrong, to do something murderous and evil, right? That in just 19 chapters we're going to be told, like, do not murder, right? And so it says they feared God. They didn't fear the Pharaoh, right? And so this fear turns away from the serpent, if you will, and causes them to be crafty like a serpent, as the Gospels say, in lying to the Pharaoh, which that could easily be off with your head.
For sure, for sure.
Behavior.
Well, let's not think about the baker from the previous chapter. Right? If you want a gruesome story, look that up. He did not have a great ending.
I mean, the Pharaoh is well within his right to just kill them, but instead God rewards them with families of their own because they feared God. And so this word fear still means fear. Okay, so it's not like the definition of fear is changing, but the context of fear has now gone from shame and to like making rash decisions to a connection to worship, right? Were they going to bow down to the king of Egypt? Were they going to bow down to the Pharaoh and obey his every command, right? Which is a form of worship. We think of worship as prayer and praise, right? But worship really is, who do you give your life to? Who do you give your adoration to? Who do you give your submission and obedience to? As well as singing and praying. And because they feared God more than the Pharaoh, they trusted that this would be some sort of act of worship,
right,
unto God by doing something tricky against the trickster, this Pharaoh, and God rewards them for fearing God. And so I wish I could flesh that out and say that, well, okay, I'll word it this way. I want to be able to say this is where the definition of fear itself turns into something else other than fear. But it's still fear, but now it's connected to worship, is the point I want to make. They were willing to worship and adore and follow and submit to God up and above the Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. And that says something of their service and their worship.
Well, and it's interesting because I think, we talked about practical takeaways, and I think it's really easy to write up this example as historical. And the reality of it is, I would, venture to say, the vast, 99.9% of our listeners, are coming at this from, a very Western perspective. But the reality is there are closed countries where Christians are persecuted to this day, and the very act of worship could and does put them in danger of physical harm and potentially even a death.
For sure. And so, and for us, for most of us, fear not only is connected to worship, but will reveal something about our worship. And so here's what I mean by that. Let's say you carry this fear of finances and financial ruin.
Sure.
Well, there's still room to worship Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Let's say you have this fear that no one likes you and no one respects you, and we all have had at least one of those people that constantly yearn for attention and constantly yearn for, right? And they're great people in their own right, but man, they can like really suck the energy out of a room, right? Well, what about El Roi, the God who sees you in Genesis 16? And so these things that we fear will actually sort of expose an aspect of our worship that's missing. It's like, so if I really fear like, oh gosh, I'm one step away from financial ruin or whatever, well, that's what voice is telling me that?
Right.
Because God even has a name of Jehovah Jireh. That means that God's always going to provide. God's always going to provide and provide enough. And I like this El Roi one too. It's Hagar when Abraham dismisses her after abusing and using her for trying to create a son and create a blessing in the world. He just dismisses her because Sarah gets really upset at her, and Hagar claims that God doesn't see her, but then God shows up. Yep. Says, oh, you are the God that sees me. Yep. And so what you fear likely has an aspect of God that just has yet to be worshipped in your heart and trusted and obeyed. And that's okay. There's grace for that. And there's friends that can encourage us in that. And there's examples in other people's lives that will help us see that in their lives. And so it's not the end. If it was the end, that would be fear winning the day. But what I am trying to say is when you recognize a fear in yourself, also try and recognize what aspect of God might be missing in your worship or in your adoration of him.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense? So let's go to our next famous verse that has fear in it. And this is Proverbs 9:10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I've gotten into some debates with folks over the years about this topic of fear.
Sure.
Where it's like, no, when it says like, you have to fear God, you always have to be afraid of him. Like because fear of the God is the beginning of wisdom. And again, you'll get this sense as I go through this, I still do believe that the word fear means fear. But when it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, that tells me there's still something more to this story.
Right.
There's something more to the journey. And then as I looked up the wording in this verse, that word about the beginning of wisdom is often the word that's used for like the beginning of a journey or a trip.
Nice.
Or a trek. It's this first action step. And so the fear of the Lord is the first step towards wisdom. But notice it's not the culmination of wisdom. It's not wisdom herself, as the Proverbs would say. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there's tons to say here about this, but Proverbs itself is in large part trying to orient, especially the beginning of Proverbs, is trying to orient young men towards making right decisions. Okay? And young women too, but the specific language is often like, don't go after the harlot in the streets. Pursue lady wisdom in the streets, right? And so the fear of the Lord being the beginning of the wisdom is like, hey, there are consequences to succumbing to the harlot. Yep. Fear God in that. Okay. But that fear then says, well, if not this, then what? I take my first step towards wisdom, just in denying myself the pleasures of the harlot.
Right.
That's the first step that this verse is trying to get young men and women to understand.
Right. Yeah, and it's a trap. You know, if you don't zoom out on that and understand the larger redemption story, that's where oftentimes you can get into this trap of just trying to limit life, and it's like, well, hang on, zoom out. Let's see what happens. Let's run the tape on this and see what happens, and then you get a different perspective.
Yeah. And that different perspective largely comes in the Gospels. And I'm not going to read all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I also don't want this to be like a trust me, bro section of the... but do your homework on this.
Sure.
Like, go through the Gospels or do a Bible Gateway search of fear and then just choose you can check off the 4 Gospels and read all the verses there. But my summary is going to be this. Fear, whenever it's coming from God or the angels, is always in the line, do not fear. God never comes and says, fear me. He's always doing, do not fear, get up, right? To Peter, it's like, do not fear, and then Peter walks on water. The shepherds, right? The angels come, and the angels are like, do not fear. A Savior has been born in Bethlehem. Yeah. Right? The women go to the tomb, and an angel's there, and the angel says, do not fear. And they fear anyway in the book of Mark. Right? Actually, I think that's going to be my next one. Let's do that while I get there. So in Mark, this is actually how I wanted to summarize it. So in Mark, there's all these moments about do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. So in Mark, the women are at the tomb and it says, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, or don't fear, right, is another translation of it. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And now the last verse is trembling and bewildered. Some of the translations say fearful and astonished. The women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And if you are looking at your Bibles right now, or even Bible Gateway or whatever, you'll see that there's like a bunch more verses. I think 12 more verses that are after this. Most scholars at this point think that those verses got added in later. And that the original ending to the book of Mark is actually this very last line of, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Here's what Mark's doing. And I think this is actually genius. And I actually agree with recent scholarship and theologians on this, that the book should have ended here in verse 8. It places us, the reader, in the shoes of the women. And it asks the question, knowing what you know, that Jesus has conquered death and risen from the grave, will you go and tell the message of this to others with your words and with your life? Or will you be afraid? And so one could say that the gospel culminates on the very question of fear.
Interesting.
Our response to the gospel culminates with a fear question. And if we think it's that we are to fear God, we've kind of missed it then in the gospels, right? Now, if we've only read the Old Testament and then we magically just skip to Mark 16:8, then it's like, then I might think, like, oh, this is just asking me to fear God. But really, God's trying to cure fear and remove fear. And I know that because of my last verse, and then we can reflect together here. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And so the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but perfect love casts out fear. And we journey with our fear as a result. And if there's fear when it comes to sharing the good news of the gospel with others, well, it's not because of God trying to make us afraid. It's that our fear hasn't encountered his perfect love quite yet in that area. If we're afraid to walk on water, if we're afraid to encounter the hard truth of what we need to do with our finances to avoid financial ruin, right? That's a fear in us, but God, in his perfect love, wants us to journey from initially saying, like, yeah, I'm going to fear God and his commands and his grandeur, his omnipotence, right? His all-knowing power. Like, all these things are worthy of fear, particularly in the same way that I need to be careful on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Right? I need to be careful crossing the street.
Yeah,
There's
that tie-in with awe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But love brings me to the awe of the Grand Canyon as well. Love sends me on my way to cross the street and make hard decisions and go to the bank and start a savings program or whatever, right? Like fear is there at the eclipse of greatness, of grandeur, of awe, and most of all, of love. And so fear itself has this journey, has this invitation to it to tag on the tagline of the namesake of the podcast that ultimately lands in, will we trust in God's perfect love to cast out all our fear? What are you cooking on in all this? Where's your mind going?
Well, it's just such a perfect culmination and certainly not easy.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the point to wrestle with, right? If this was easy, there'd be a lot less people running around consciously or unconsciously moving through their lives based on a fear response. Because, I guess good, jumping off point into the next section, but it's courage. And oftentimes, in order to have the courage, we need to have the clarity. And so there's this bridge of understanding and getting to that perfect love that switches on the bent towards action versus a diminishment. I can't share this. I can't, there's something inside me that I know the world should see, but it's scary. So I'm going to sit on it.
Yeah. Yep. And I think the last thing I'll say is you might have been expecting me to end with something about the revelation and the afterlife, and I intentionally left that out because it's kind of its own topic. Now, I came to Jesus because of a fear of the afterlife destination of hell, right? And so I want to kind of spend 2 seconds here to acknowledge, like, okay, yeah, there are spiritual fears and there's afterlife fears, and I think we'll eventually get there in the podcast. I'm not going to place a date on it or an expectation on it, but I do want to eventually get there and do some, what is the kingdom of heaven? What is hell? What are some of these things? But they need to be their own episodes. But to cover the journey of the word itself, we did the job here, in my opinion. We got all the way to the very end of the Bible and talked about how fear itself culminates. So I did at least want to mention that and acknowledge that if you're listening to this and you're like, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this in Revelation? I hear you.
Yep.
It's just going to require its own invitation podcast episode at some point.
Agreed.
So
if you don't see that soon enough, let us know.
yeah, ping us.
We'll make it happen.
So yeah, man. What do you got?
Yeah, well, I would belt out, because fear ultimately is a liar. So I would belt out, this wonderful song, but then we'd probably get copyright infringement because the algorithm would say I sound too much like Zach Williams. And, we can't have that,
I don't know the song, but if I have the editing time, I think we're allowed like 10 seconds max.
Oh, really?
So I'll see. Only if I have the editing time.
All right.
Because I don't know the song.
There you go.
Sing it to me afterwards.
I will.
Thanks.
So, story time. Recently took my little ones, 7 and 4, son and a daughter, respectively, took them out to a water park. Tons of water slides, all different levels, age appropriate, right? And my children, specifically my oldest, terrified.
The older one.
Terrified. Yeah. Which then, of course, makes the younger one also terrified.
She caught the contagious fear.
Yeah, that's how it is, right? It's the same thing with dinner time food. I don't like that. Oh, well, clearly I don't like that. My brother didn't like it. Anyway, parenting was aside. I digress. You got these scary slides. It took 6 hours of an 8-hour day to finally get my children onto these slides. Spoiler alert, they loved it.
Awesome.
Right?
Yeah, great.
But also think about that wasted time. They wasted this prime time because once they got the experience that was exhilarating and probably still scary, right? They got to experience what I had been saying, which is, this is awesome. And now it's, can we go again? Can we go again? Can we go again? Of course we can, but also now, we gotta start thinking about dinner. So let's, get as many slides in as we can. So here's why I bring this story up. My father heart is not gonna put them on something that's gonna mess them up, right? They're gonna get through this. I'm gonna be there. My wife's going to be there at the end waiting to catch them and scoop them up safely. But yet there's this fear, right? That something's going to happen. And that fear, especially for my son, gripping, right? Immobilizing, right? I'm even to the point of trying to take them into the, the wave pool, and freak out. Okay. All right. Well, back it off a bit, right? Gotta just do this on his time. But here's the question. We have a better, perfect Father. Where are we being diminished in our lives because we're not trusting that He's got us? Where are we not trusting our Father to say, hey, there's this exhilarating thing on the other side. I'm not leaving you. I got you. I'm not saying it's not going to be wild.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not going to be a crazy adventure with, perilous pitfalls, and some pucker moments. But guess what?
Sure.
I got you.
Yeah.
And where we're going, it's going to be one heck of a ride.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I just want to invite you into that idea of understanding that our wonderful, perfect Father has an epic story for us. And oftentimes that is diminished because of lies that we're buying from an enemy.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't want to see.
Who told you were naked? Right? And like what voice are you listening to right now?
Yes.
And I love that it wasn't the lifeguards and it wasn't some rando kid.
Sure.
It was the love of the Father that got your kiddos to get down that slide. And the voice.
Right.
The voice of the Father to use that Genesis 3 language.
They were listening to another voice. They were listening to that anxiety, and they were letting fear cripple the forward action.
Yeah, it's such a good practical example of that.
And speaking of, right, we've covered this in another season, the acronym of FEAR.
Okay. False
evidence appearing real.
Oh, that's good.
And that's what it's worth bringing up again, because that's what fear is. It's false evidence. It's an improper narrative, right? So then that takes us to this idea of how we move through life. And typically, it's problematic to look in the rear view. Think about going and running your errands, right? What do you think would happen if you were looking in the rearview mirror the whole time you're trying to go out to the grocery store? Probably not going to end well, right? We want same thing with life. We want to be looking out the windshield, surveying, taking sounding points, and figuring this out. Mm-hmm. However, this is a good occasion to look in the rear view. You're still standing, which means that you've conquered every single obstacle and hard situation to date. You're still here.
Yeah, true.
So look back. Some of us have had that incredible realization, man, the Lord got me through that. And then as time passes, that diminishes, right? In our own minds. The enemy says, was that really God? Or was that just luck? And so if we don't stay focused, it's easy to have those incredible moments of provision, of protection, diminished. So it is important to look in the rear view. And if you haven't done this exercise, I would encourage you to do so and say, hey, God, where were you in those situations where ultimately it was tough, but here I am, right? And I realize that's incredibly tough to do in the valley, in the hard moments. So context is important. But when you're at a place where you can look at these situations with clarity, that's a good exercise to do. Which takes me to my next point. Because this fear is false evidence, but we internalize it and we take it on as real. How do we overcome that, right? So that takes us to courage, which we're a big fan of definitions here. So before I get to courage, obviously, let's just touch on, since this is about fear. Merriam-Webster says fear is an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger, right? That takes us to this wonderful definition, also by Merriam, of courage. Mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. So it's not a lack of fear. We don't only move forward once fear has been conquered. Fear gets conquered. Forward action conquers this. It's action in spite of fear. And so, again, that's where you touched on having the ultimate hope and victory can help give us that. But in the moment, and this is what I wanted to spend a little bit more time in looking at a more granular level, when we're in the thick of it, there are some tools that we can apply to really kind of claw through some of these more tricky situations that just tend to bind us up and slow us down in the day-to-day. So anything on that before I dive into?
I love that the Merriam definition included the anticipation. So it said the anticipation or awareness.
Yep.
And, there's the type of awareness that's like, I'm in a jungle and there's a lion, right? That's awareness that causes fear. And that's good in that moment.
Healthy.
Most of us that are tuned into our iPhones right now and live some sort of middle-class life, right? Like, most of our fear, the vast majority of our fear is the anticipation, is the other word they used in that Merriam dictionary definition. In the brain, which you might be getting this, so I hope I'm not stealing someone, but in the brain, it's the same exact thing.
And I'll cover the science behind that actually in the next section, why that's happening and how we can combat that. Because you're right, we go to fight or flight.
But again, I want to acknowledge that fear is very real as a result. So when you heard the awareness or the anticipation as the listener, it's okay. It's okay to recognize, gosh, even just the anticipation of something is causing me fear. You get it.
It keeps us safe. But what do we do with it? Right? That's the secret sauce there. So part of this is to take from a more scientific approach is this idea called cognitive reframing, right? Which in layman's terms means thinking about our thinking, right? So, without getting too, meta on you, the best way to do this is to share another story. Because as I was researching this and figuring out the best way to convey this message about fear, a wonderful situation happened where I was at a jiu-jitsu practice for my son, and something happened on the mats, a little tiff with another student that I missed. I was having a conversation with another parent, and even though I had seen some of the other portions of the practice, I missed this interaction. And so, coming back, it wasn't a huge deal. Coach saw what happened. It's a contact sport. There was an unintentional injury. Coach took care of it, and both sparring partners shook hands, and we moved on. It happens. That being said, I experienced things coming up in me, wanting to defend my child, wanting to, how about this? Fear of shame, right? Because of how I parent or don't parent, and how this situation reflects through my son reflects on me. These things just well up just subconsciously,
Just
so
immediately, too.
quickly,
Yeah.
so insidiously.
Yeah.
And so I probably would have stayed in that place were it not for what I was working on for this podcast. And then I said, wait a second, let's practice what we preach here. Let's invite the Lord into this. Lord, what do you want me to know about this situation? And he said, this is awesome. What? What do you mean? This is the perfect time for these situations to happen for your son, because he's not going to remember this tiff with another partner in his class, but there's a good chance that he remembers the lesson. What do we learn about taking care of our partners? What do we learn about apologizing when mistakes happen in a full contact sport? What do we learn about sportsmanship? What do we learn about listening to our coach and respecting our coach, regardless of how we feel about it in the moment? So it was like, whoa.
Yeah, that's good.
Whoa, what a reframe. But had I not been paying radical attention, I'm missing that. So I bring that up to draw a real world example of how easy this is to do and how easy this is not to do. Yeah. You've got to be asking, you've got to be plugged in. So this is just one of those silver threads that weave through a lot of the content and the topic that we talk about at the Invitation podcast, because this isn't just the big stuff. It really touches on those little day-to-day incidences that we have with family, coworkers, our community, and our loving Father.
And I'll add one more to that list that you just gave, which was an amazing list, but what your kids think of their dad gets formed in these moments too. Might not remember the incident, but they'll carry with them a sense of like, oh, my dad didn't freak out, but he did participate. He did get in there. And real honest moment here, like one of the main rifts between me and my dad is the way he handled me getting beamed in Little League, getting hit in the head with a pitch, and how he responded. That's where it started. The rift between me and my own dad, because it was all out of fear and anger and me and him about the way he was acting in that moment. And so the fact that you were able to pay attention and redeem the situation rather than just act out or just act out of fear, even though it might look like what you didn't do in that situation that you probably could have out of anger and out of fear, it actually like is building something that I don't have with my own dad. Cheers, Dad.
Well, hey, good thanks. Yeah, it's interesting to see, and I miss this stuff sometimes too.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But we have a loving Father that gives us this perfect example, and we get to come back every morning, right? So mercies are new every morning, right? And it's so freeing because we don't have to bat 1,000 to stay in the game, right?
Yeah.
And along that line, here's some of the questions that you can run in your head as you're thinking about your thinking. What am I believing? Okay. Once we've identified that, next question is, where did that thought come from, right? If you don't know, again, perfect invitation to bring the Lord into that conversation. And then here is just in terms of personal improvement, I think this is a key piece. And, you and I both read Atomic Habits, and I think this is a key piece that James Clear is trying to bring across. You can't just eliminate a poor thought. You can't just eliminate a bad habit.
Yeah.
Because once that's created, you now have a vacuum. And that hole will get filled. The temptation is to just say, well, I removed the bad thought. I removed the bad habit. Yeah. However, something's going to come in and make a house there.
That's right.
Right? So we need to replace that with a better thought. We need to actually dive into saying, okay, this is a lie.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Lord, what do you say about this situation? Going through a book that does a lot on identity by Jamie Winship, Living Fearless. Highly recommend it. Nice. But I really like his process of not only identifying, but then inviting the Lord in to replace. You've got to put something better, right? I'll zoom out for a second just because when we live in what certainly feels like a tumultuous time period in history, the only answer to a bad idea is a better idea, right? We can't just leave this hole, right? So there's a lot there, but we'll leave it there. So cognitive reframing, just to recap, let's think about our thinking. And certainly there's a lot of biblical application there. Kind of talked about, I looked at, taking every thought captive, but there's some different implications there that I think steer away from the heart of this. But in terms of how we actually deal with this, let's step into something very practical. We need to have a physical response when we feel fear grip us. And when I say grip us, typically it does. Because when we're unaware, physiologically, we tighten.
Yes.
Right? And in our tightening, not only is that affecting our muscular system, it also is affecting our nervous system and it's activating our fight or flight response. Our breathing actually becomes shallow. And that's what puts us into that fight or flight state.
There's
right?
the line.
Exactly. Yeah. Right there. We're getting chased by something that is large and fast and has large teeth and sharp fangs.
And luscious hair.
That's right. Breathe. That's the invitation. Much like the power of pause keeps us in a place that allows us to respond versus reacting. Breathing in this situation is powerful. And then, there's tons of ways. There's, box breathing. There's, the double inhale.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a few rounds of that. There's lots of different, special forces do this. There's, some psychologists have their own. Find out what works for you. I prefer to not be dogmatic about the prescription.
Sure.
But just letting all that go and just breathe deeply. Breathe in fully, exhale fully, and do that for a little period of time, whatever, consciously.
Yeah, do it for a conscious amount of time.
Correct. And what you'll find is that actually helps us to return to a parasympathetic state, which in layman's terms means we're telling our body everything is safe, it's under control, I am okay, I am enough. And now, even, left brain, right brain thinking, it allows us to now re-access our higher executive function and respond the way that we would like to. Yeah. So I think that's just a huge takeaway when we I just thought about this, but let's bring in another tactical, practical that probably is going to impact 95+% of listeners. I bet in the last week you've gotten at least one email that puts you in a fight or flight.
No, sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Taxes.
Sure.
Email from the bank, email from the boss, from that one colleague.
Yeah.
Right? We know. Sure. Social media ping highlights someone else's opinion, and we find ourselves going to Trigger Town pretty quick.
Yep.
Right? Breathe. Yeah. Right? God.
Mhm.
And, I think it's a fun notion. I can't remember where this came up. You and I talked about it.
Mhm.
There's an idea that, do not fear appears in the Bible like 365 times, which would, correspond to one, you do not fear for every day, which is a fun notion. Um, in reality, it's about 70, according to my research. But I don't think that diminishes how important this is to our Heavenly Father. 70 times. There's only 66 books of the Bible. Okay? So
Sure.
to have this mentioned 70 times is significant, right? And I think it leaves a clue in terms of how, as followers of Christ, we're meant to move through this world
Yes.
with boldness. Because if we're operating from fear, we're not operating from boldness. And that boldness carries with it the Lord's light, grace, etc. And so I think that's something that I wanted to land on, because it allows us to act with the authority that comes from knowing Christ has the ultimate victory. And I think maybe that's an apt tie into, without, getting into the whole, Revelation story, but still operating from a true understanding of the ultimate victory.
And
So
I'll chip in real quick
please.
that the some of us, I know I brought up like afterlife fears and revelation and everything. A lot of us have come into faith of Jesus with the afterlife fears being cured and relieved, of like, oh, now I don't fear the afterlife. But then the gospel stops there. But you're telling us, oh, this good news, this particular good news of the gospel is supposed to invade every day.
Yes.
Invade every area of my life, and to be carried with me with a sense of power and authority.
Yes.
In this heavenly realm here on earth.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that you're doing that. You're kind of bringing this down to like, this isn't about some like afterlife status or afterlife relief of fear. How intimidating would it be if I told my daughters, like, after you graduate high school, that's when all your fears will go away? Well, gosh, that leaves middle school and high school, and there's a lot of fearful situations in those
Sure.
ages. And so, like, why would God do that to the whole of our lives, where it's like, just press through, and then when you get to afterlife, all will be taken care of? That's a hollow gospel. So that's a diminished gospel, and you're the one saying there's so much more, and it comes
So
right down
much
to the
more.
present moment.
So much more. And I think here's what's happening, okay? Fear keeps us from operating in our true Christ-given identity. And so what do we do with this? In closing, we need to identify where fear is creeping into our life, because it's robbery. You're being robbed. When fear is in control, and fear, even in a diminishing aspect, maybe it's not debilitating, but it is diminishing your full potential. That's robbery. And if you knew that somebody was robbing you, what would you do? Right? What would happen if every day you came in and, it's like Moe and Calvin and Hobbes, maybe one of our younger listeners, but a lot of folks, eventually you're gonna find a different route, or you're gonna get some allies, you're gonna figure it out, right? If someone is stealing from you, you're gonna do something about it. Well, guess what? Someone's stealing from you. He's got a name. He's the enemy. It's Satan. And on the other side of that is a good Lord that wants you to come into a true identity that, quite frankly, Satan fears. He fears us operating out of our true Christ-given identity because of the impact that someone can have when they are fully alive and operating from his goodness and fullness and protection and provision. So you're not going to tolerate it in the physical world. Don't tolerate it in the spiritual world either. So if you don't know where to start, this is where you ask the Lord. Where is fear robbing you? Lord, where is fear robbing me of life to the full, right? Look up John 10:10, right? And really figure out if this is something that we can identify on our own, spend some time listening. Write down the first thing you hear. It may seem ridiculous.
Sure.
Don't care. Write it down. And then let's listen on it. And here's where listening with a safe person to help discern what you wrote down can often be the key to understanding next steps. But this is a powerful journey that allows you to take back your true spiritual inheritance and live life in a much more bold, fantastic way, because that's the true adventure, right? That's the better story that God's calling you into. And guess what? It's on the other side of fear.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really good. I think one of the things I was thinking about this whole time has been part of my like post-concussion journey, and I hope to tie in just a few of your points all in one story here. But I went to a week and a half long post-concussion camp, as my one friend said, a center. And on one of the first exercises they asked me to do, they said, let me just see you take a deep breath. I was like, okay. I literally only breathed as deep as my collarbones. And the technician literally just laughed at me. And I was like, what? She's like, you didn't get past your collarbones on your deep breath. Like, try and like slowly breathe with your whole lungs all the way down in your belly. And they actually like were able to take an fMRI, a functional MRI, and see like my brain's activity. And there was a way more than typical activity in the fear portion of the brain, the reptile brain. That's what they call it. And after a week and a half of like post-concussion rehab, my brain completely changed in its function, and there was a lot less going on in the fear portion. I bring all this up to say, like, yeah, you might have had concussions that are aiding in fear. You might need to talk to a PCP about an anti-anxiety med or something like that. And so there are caveats here, but what we've covered here are still always going to be present in some form and helpful to you. Mm-hmm. And so being able to talk that through with a trusted friend, a counselor, a spouse, and work on these things, there's always going to be a need. There's always going to be a temptation towards fear. And there's always going to be opportunities right around the corner from those fears, whether it's going down a slide, whether it's a relationship, whether it's making an investment, whether it's a career change, whether it's, right? Like there's always going to be like a huge opportunity on the other side. Maybe you don't even see it, but just by like attacking that fear a little bit, who knows what world gets opened up to you on the other side as well.
Yeah, that's fun. And you know, for the leaders out there that are watching this, you're not off the hook. This is a shrink over time if it's not strengthened, just like a muscle, right? There were slides that scared me that I had to get up my courage and get to. I got flushed. And I went to one of those where you're in the tube and they close you and then boom, the bottom drops out. It's terrifying, but awesome, right? You gotta. So fun anecdote, but at the end, the net of this, we've got to be examples to others to call through, because this is something that we can all do in community, right? And each of you are your leaders in your own little spheres of influence. So how are you calling others out past their own fears, their own stories that have been diminished by lies believed? And that's a ripple effect that can really make a big impact.
Yeah. In that sense, like fear plays its hand pretty quickly, right? In the sense of, man, like taking on that fear and encountering it, especially as a leader, who knows what it opens up just by conquering it. And we're not telling you as a leader to not have fear.
Sure.
But to be real with it and to encounter it and overcome it as a leader and bring on your troops with you in that. And who knows what that can do on an... We've been talking largely about individual levels, but who knows what that can do on an organizational level too. So, yeah, it's really good. Well,
Sweet.
Thanks. That's good stuff, Kyle. Like, and hopefully we'll do a quick summary of the invitations here of just, right, like fear. You're invited to recognize how fear can turn gifts into curses.
Yep.
That fear reveals some sort of lack in our worship, typically, and I only mean that in the sense of there's an aspect of God that He wants to reveal about Himself, but our fear sometimes holds that back. Fear can help most of us come to know God, but we can't stay there in knowing the rest of Him, because perfect love casts out fear. And fear has to do with judgment. And the gospel assures us, but yet tests us in our fear. That's what we learned in Mark, right? Like the whole gospel of Mark is saying, don't have fear, don't have fear. And then it ends with a test. Like, are you going to have fear?
Yeah.
Right? And then, any summaries you want to give, invitations around fear? Fear invites us into our breath and into thinking about our thinking, into being an example to others.
Right.
So
I guess my invitation would be take a baby step into conquering whatever that fear is in your life.
Yeah, good.
Because that is a journey worth starting, and it might as well start today.
Great. Cool. Well, with all that said, may you recognize the role that fear is playing in your life and not allow it to get in the way of your worship and in the way of the amazing worlds that are just around the corner for you.
Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.
All right, man. Last chance to sing some Zach Williams.
Nice. Fear is a liar. I don't know the rest of the words, but that tracks in my head, so